These lectures are very difficult to hear, and they're even more difficult to give because of a basic universal process. In the first year, the process that is dominant is integration. And integration always comes together. And it always comes together in a very specific way. One could characterize the central core of the integration process as a path. In fact, all wisdom traditions are characterized by talk about the path, being on the path or gaining the path. And people talk about it colloquially. What is that path? That path is the motion of integration. So that the motion of integration is characterized as a path. But in the second year of our education, the path does not occur at all, because the energy that's involved, instead of being integral, is now differential. And for a differential to work properly, it must not follow a path, but it must constitute a field. So our education has 2 years because there are 2 cycles, 2 kinds of cycles which occur in reality. One is a cycle of integration that follows eventually the line of a path. The other is a cycle of differentiation that generates eventually a field. The way I used to talk 30 years ago about education was that in order to begin, you had to begin with a confusion. That a good teacher with a good course begins by confusing the student. Because the student comes in with a set of responses and expectations, a set of techniques, a set of presumptions and assumptions and projections. And this entire set must be scrambled in order for you to learn something new. So that I used to use a little wisdom story. I learned it from a Turkish friend of mine, and it's a Mullah Nasruddin story. Mullah Nasruddin is a proverbial comic sage in the Kurdish area of the world, Turkey, Iran, Iraq. And Mullah Nasruddin comes in to deliver a wisdom lecture to a population of people that are waiting. And he comes up to the podium and he looks out and he sees the sea of expectant faces, and he says to them, "Do you know what I'm going to talk about tonight?" And they shake their heads, "No, Mullah, we don't." And so he immediately walks away from the podium, walks to the exit. And they say, "Well, Mullah, what is it?" And he said, "If you don't know what I'm going to talk about, how can you possibly hear me?" And they beseech him, "Please, Mullah, please, return to the podium." And so he finally relents, and he gets up to the podium, and he looks, and a glint comes in his eye, seeing the sea of faces, and they're calmed down finally. And so he says again, "Do you know what I'm going to talk about?" And they all nod, "Yes, Mullah, we do." And he says, well, there's no need for me then to tell you. And he leaves. He goes out the door. They beseech him. They send the oldest members, and they bring him back. After a huge confusion and discussion, he gets back up to the podium, and he looks at them firmly, and finally he says, do you know what I'm going to talk about? And one man stands up who's been appointed delegate from the crowd, turban in hand, which goes against every convention, except for humorous stories. And he says, Mullah, some of us do and some of us don't. And Mullah Nasruddin says, fine, those who know will tell those who don't know. And he left permanently. All the wisdom in the world is in that story. There's no way that there's anything that you need to know that isn't in that story. It's like in reality, the is not is always a continuation of the is. It's like in a black hole. The world of light works right up to the membrane surface of the black hole, and after that surface, it doesn't work at all. Visibility works right up to the surface of a black hole and stops there, but the same energy, the same reality that worked as an is now still works, but works as an is not. So that there's a very peculiar readjustment. There's a recalibration that one has to do in wisdom. Those that claim to know have to instruct those who don't know. The is and the is not work together. They're always the same. Why are they always the same? Because in nature, for nature to exist at all, the integral must continue to work. Its operativeness must be a continuity. For nature to exist at all, if there were some way for the is not to cancel out the is, they would cancel each other out, and there would be nothing. True nothing. So that from a natural standpoint, one has to say that the real is paradoxical, the real is mysterious, that both the is and the is not occur together. And on that basis, one says that reality has a yin and a yang, both and. In the 60s, they used to use the phrase both and. Instead of either or, both and. In nuclear physics, Niels Bohr's formal theory of complementarity upon which quantum physics is based, or quantum chemistry, quantum astronomy, whatever it is. The is and the is not, both must be taken into consideration. We talked about the example of music being not only the notes, but also the intervals. The spaces of articulation are necessary to the composition. And as the great American photographer Edward Weston wrote in his day books, composition is the strongest way of seeing. Perception is wonderful, but perception is also creative, and perception is instantly creative. It composes instantly. So there's always a composition. How then does it get scrambled? It gets scrambled on the rebound. If one has a Zen mind and one is sitting on a rock looking at the chartreuse shadows of dogwood overhanging a nice little meandering stream. The pristine perception of that is the chartreuse light and the shapes of the vegetation and the motion of the stream, the solidity of the rock. That's all that's there. If you relent on your concentration, if you compromise your openness, what happens immediately is that you're bothered by flies buzzing in your ears, and it's too hot, and you're dry, and you itch. How does that scrambling happen? The scrambling happens because instead of there being a directness, instead of the integration coming on an integral, in which case it's pristine and follows this path, it gets deflected or it gets reflected. And what you have then is, the word that comes to me, maybe you're not familiar with it, panoply. You have a lot of different confusing qualities that suddenly are rebounding and bouncing all over. Where are these rebounds coming from? These rebounds are coming from the mind. The natural direct perception, the eye, the optical nerve, the neuron nets in the brain, they receive the perception pristinely. One can learn a kind of recovery yoga. That's a kind of a very advanced Mahayana based on Pythagoras, no less. And one can go back and bring back a confused perception and screen it progressively by a yogic concentration, and you can reconstitute the pristineness of the perception. You can tune out the confusion and go back years later, decades later, and see exactly what it was. The greatest yoga master of this was Marcel Proust. Wrote a huge epic novel that was in 7 volumes. No one can grind finer than French Jews on the warpath. He wanted to get it exactly right for once before he dies. He wanted to know, what is it? All right, what is it? What's going on in life? What's going on in me? Whatever it is, I want to know. I need to know. I'm going to know. And so, remembrance of things past, a la recherche de temps perdu, is an epic of learning to re-normalize the confusion of the past into the pristine present. And what happens is that when the past is cleaned up like that, renormalized, instead of it being past, it becomes present. The time dimension shrinks away as you chip away the patina of confusion, the patina of the confusion that is reflected maybes and ifs off the mind. Time shrinks back and the past becomes present. And there is only present. And in that presence of the present, it is ambidextrous to you whether it is or isn't. It doesn't make any difference at all whether it is or isn't. And thus one characterizes spiritual presence on that level as an equilibrium, as an equanimity, as a tranquility. Because you do not have any druthers whatsoever. and you realize that the emotional tether that had you by the throat, that made the confusion aggravating, was because that tether, the substrate, was time. Not just because it was time, it's not that time is a culprit, but a quality, a characteristic, it's hard to even say, of time. Why? Because time is inexorably forward. The physical basis of the direction of time. Time always moves forward. Why the hell does time always move forward? And it's a very good question. But in order to see why that question not only is a very good question, but that it's answerable in a very paradoxical way, the paradoxical way being that in absolute reality, there is no difference between time running forward or time running backward. Because the equations that describe the way in which extant energy works in nature, those equations solve as easily in the negative as they do in the positive. The Maxwell equations for electromagnetism solve negatively as well as positively. In fact, one comes to the conclusion eventually, in a kind of mathematical hard nut case, that Lorentz transformations solve as beautifully for a determinant negative one as they do for a determinant positive one, upon which an awful lot of physics, chemistry, astronomy, science is based. And all of this has to do with the mysteriousness vis-a-vis time. There is such a thing as temporal order. And one of the things about temporal order is that time, in order for time to occur at all, there in fact is an oscillation. And that oscillation is not mysterious at all now, but originally it was very mysterious. Because it wasn't apparent that there was an oscillation. All that one knew was that there was a movement. The first human being to work with electricity consciously characterized electricity as a universal fluid that worked like water. That person was Benjamin Franklin. He was the first human being on this particular planet to really consciously get it. You know, flying the kite in the thunderstorm? And where did the lightning hit symbolically? It hit on the key to his front door. Do you get it? He got it. And right away, a serendipitous invention from the Dutch, no less. I mean, Lawrence was Dutch. I mean, the Dutch are always somehow, they're the Dutch and the Poles. Somehow, fortuitously, there's always one there to help when you really need it. And in Franklin's time was a man named Leighton. And he made a kind of a jar, a glass jar, called a Leyden jar, still today called a Leyden jar, which stores electricity. And Franklin, being universal genius on the level of Socrates, got it. That universal fluid not only is operating everywhere, but that man can save it if he builds the right receptor for it. And if he can save it, that means that he can also build the right projector for it, which means that you can control where it's going to be applied. And so you can have electricity as a tool. You can tap it, you can save it, you can turn it loose, which means that you can use it as a tool. You can work with it. And he characterized it as a universal fluid that has a flow. But that flow language didn't last very long because there was a Frenchman named Ampère who said, "Ah, yes, it flows like a stream, but we must not call it a flow, we must call it a current. And my," meaning Ampère, "my calibration of how much that current is will be the way in which people measure it, and we do. We call them amps." And a little beautiful British guy that used to lecture on Friday nights in London to crowds of men and women, a guy named Michael Faraday, who never went to school. He didn't need to go to school. He worked with Sir Humphrey Davies every day, and Davies just filled him in. Said, "You need this, you need to know this, you need to know this." And by that time, the self-made Faraday was one of the great geniuses of physics in the 19th century. He came to understand that what makes the flow is that electric current in the wire has the atoms of the copper or the tungsten that jump up and down, that oscillate their position in space, and that's what the current really is. That electrical energy in the wire is really the flow of the wave, and what makes the wave is that the atoms jump up and down, they oscillate. And so that movement of electricity, the current of electricity, is in some very deep way, formally, a time paradigm. That any oscillation in space will produce a flow that can be characterized as a temporality, a current, and that's the way energy is understood. And it's no wonder that several generations later, time-space were integrated together because, it was always a foregone conclusion from the time of Faraday on. But a very peculiar thing. There were mysteries that surrounded the flow through the wire because there's also such a thing as resistance. Those atoms of copper or tungsten don't want to jump up and down. They want to stay where they are. They're very happy where they are. Why should we jump for you? You know what the Hollywood word is that you throw in? Addressing people that are trying to disturb your peace. They jump because there is a force, there's energy being fed to them. And that energy follows an integral. It follows this path, which in this case is the wire. So that the wire in a way is a vector. The wire is a vector for the current which is flowing through, which brings with it the time quality. But all the time quality and the current and the motion through it is engendering resistance. And so that resistance then produces an auxiliary field that surrounds the wire. Not only is there something which can be measured like an amp in the wire, but there is like an ongoing cloud along the environment of the wire that also is a part of what's going on. And it was a little bit beyond Faraday because it was beyond Davies. And it took a man named Maxwell, James Clerk Maxwell, who, working with this stuff, incidentally, invented color photography. The chemical principles upon which color photography are based. So think of how much the industry of color photography is worth. The whole movie industry and everything else. Advertising. Enormous. He could have been, trillionaire by now if he had taken out patents. And Maxwell understood that the electricity in the wire is there, but the magnetic field around the wire has to be integrated to it. Why? Because in nature, integration is the law. It's the principle. It's God's own commandment. Let them get together. Or some such thing. It's like the whole principle of gravity. If once you have stuff, stuff gets together. So that the entire ensemble of nature, no matter how complex it is, no matter how extensive it is, must respond to integration, and the integration always cores itself on a path, and that integral path is the fundamental basis upon which Feynman diagrams are based. And there's no way that you can prove that Feynman diagrams really work, except that they do work. And so they're being used more and more because they simply do work. But in order to get to the sheer chutzpah genius of Feynman, of being able to have path integral diagrams, we have to backtrack a little bit. We have to see that science, the science of 1990s, mid-1990s, the science of the early 21st century, is based upon reality and not just existence. It's based upon the is not and the is having equilibrium and forming the same line, the same path integral, and both have to be taken into consideration. That's why this whole education begins, and it'll begin in a month again, just like it always has. It'll begin with the I Ching. Because the fundamental principle of the I Ching is that the universe operates not by chance, but by change. That God doesn't throw dice, he's not a gambler, but he's an artist and he likes things to be different. He likes change. And so transformation indexes the real. Transformation indexes the real. And the real takes in both integration and differentiation. And as long as one has in the first year of the education a firm development of the way in which integration, the integral path, works, when it comes to the transformation to a differential energy, where instead of there being a path, there's a field. And instead of the path integrating more and more, the field generates differentially more and more. So you have more and more openness. So the correct characterization of reality, taking a little lesson from the historical Buddha, I don't have one here, but he held up a flower one time. The stem of the flower is the integral path, and the flower is the differential. The flower is the symbol of the real, because that's the way it happens. All that energy, life energy, has to come together. It has to come together in a stem, and that stem flows to a certain point where it buds and then flowers. So this education is a flower. I'm giving you a flower. I'm giving you a boutonniere without which you can't get into heaven. Why? Because heaven will not be there where you are unless you do both together. And if you do, it'll be there wherever you are. You don't have to get somewhere to be saved. You just have to be real. And when you are, God's right there. Totally real. Not at all there when there's confusion. As long as there's confusion, it's an indication of a reflective panoply, a cacophony, which relentlessly does not permit clarity to occur, and without clarity, resonances do not come to consonance. And the whole purpose of an integral path is that consonance in equanimity be its perfection. And when integration is perfected, differentiation completes itself, just like a flower budding. You don't have to bribe it. You don't have to coax it. You don't have to threaten it. You don't have to play clever little parody games with it. It's a gift. It's there gratis. All of this is to say that the science section of our education not only culminates the education, but goes back into the past of the education and brings it all present. Just like Marcel Proust. Goes back and saves the past, saves the other 7 sections from merely being some kind of regression back in time, brings them all present so they all reel together. That's where the art of education, one has to be an artist to do this. Of course, the scale is enormous. I think to perform Wagner's Ring cycle of those 4 operas takes, about 20 hours? This takes 156 hours. Big time. What does that make it? That makes it 20 goes into 168. So this is 8 times as big an opera as the Ring cycle. It's hard to do that. But the only way that it works is if you participate. If you don't participate, it happens for me. And I go away with my hands in my pockets, whistling like Brer Rabbit. Well, I look back and there's nobody there, and I think, better go back and try again. What's going on? What is going on is that untutored reflections are still happening and still confusing. Where are those reflections? Those reflections are off the inside of the cranium. N'est-ce pas, sweetie? Off the inside of the cranium. And we talked about how images which characterize myth, which are the fundamental building blocks of language, natural language, that mythic horizon, that image base that stretches and then curves itself all by itself, and when it curves fully, that image base curved fully around becomes a world. It's like a bubble. It's like a bubble inside the cranium. And that world is the source of reflection. It's just like when the mythic language horizon matures itself and becomes spherical, all by the principles like psychic gravity, becomes a world, the inside of the cranium gets all silvered with achievement and self-importance, and it reflects back, and so any perception that comes into it gets bounced around in there so that everybody collects their little fee. All these middlemen of this egotistical world inside, they all want their share. How do you think we stay in business, they say? They don't like clarity. We're going to put them out of business. We don't want clarity. How are we going to maintain ourselves? If we have clarity, nobody's going to consult us. The perceptions are just going to be there. Where are they going to be? They're going to be not in time, but in eternity, in presence, in spiritual presence. To use a quippy phrase here, hell is just a pastime. That's a triple entendre. Later tonight, as you get it, there'll be Snickers all over Los Angeles, right? Cheeky. Those reflections are like rebounds. And the whole purpose, like Maxwell and Faraday and Ampere and Franklin, is to dampen the resistance forces And if you dampen the resistance forces, it becomes clearer and clearer to see what actually does happen. You can chill electric wire. And the most beautiful way of chilling electric wire is to immerse it into liquid helium. So that anybody who gets involved in this turns up owning a copy of this book, The Properties of Liquid and Solid Helium. Feynman has a lot of little essays early on, mathematical essays. He always loved liquid helium. One of the things that he loved to see. Why? Because helium is the second element. The only thing before helium is hydrogen. And once you have hydrogen and helium, it's like having tau and Te. Then you have a process that eventually, if the integration goes far enough, becomes a star. That's all you need. It would be nice to have a trace of lithium, but you really don't need it. It's just nice. But you have to have hydrogen and a little bit of helium in order to have enough integration so that matter becomes a star. Without that, the game doesn't begin. You just have dull, inert, clumpy things that are not stars. There are no planets that can evolve life. Nothing's going on. So that helium's very important. Liquid helium cooling these wires. What's happening when they cool? It means that the electric current becomes more and more discernible as its flow, and the magnetic field evens out so that it has its structure just as it should be. What stops this clarity from occurring can be characterized by the word perturbation. What makes the confusion is perturbation. All the reflections of the ego mind are due to perturbation. It's just like when Galileo went into Jupiter's magnetic field. The last time any satellite went into Jupiter's magnetic field was Voyager 2, back about 1981. And Jupiter's magnetic field had a period of 10 hours, very smooth. And it had had that for who knows how many hundreds of millions of years. But when Galileo came in just a few days ago, the magnetic field of Jupiter is flip-flopping all over. Why? Because there was perturbation from the Levy-Shoemaker comet. 21 parts of the comet came in and perturbated the planets. Not just its atmosphere, but because Jupiter has the rotation, the hydrogen and the helium especially rotating, it sets up a magnetic field around an electric current. And as Maxwell showed, that the magnetism and the electric components work together in a complementation, so you have to call it electromagnetism. And in fact, they work in an inverse proportion with each other. Now, one of the most paradoxical things is that inverse proportions characterize the universe in clarity, but they also double up, to use a pun which you'll get in a moment. They double up as mirror reflections. Inverse ratios are real mathematically, but they also, at the very same time, characterize mirror reflections, which are the very essence of ego confusions. And one of the most disturbing things about modern physics, that is all based upon perturbation theory. It works beautifully for perturbations, but no one really knows what a non-perturbative process is like, because it's not observable. It's real. It's there. They are there. But they're discreetly hidden in the mystery of a tranquil yogi. So that one comes to something like this book, published Cambridge University Lecture Notes in Physics, 1994, Diagrammatica, The Path to Feynman Diagrams. I've excerpted a few things here. Let me just go through the excerpts. There are, I think, 5 quotations, and you'll see what I'm getting at. And we can take a break. We're talking about the universe and how to characterize it. We need some language. Feynman diagrams are a very good language. Even though they're kind of iffy mathematically, they still work. Why do they work? Because diagrams are abstract images. Means they're symbolic images rather than mythic images. They're abstract images, and these abstract images, like abstract art, bridge the mythic language worlds and the mind that is made by them with symbolic ideas and mind, which is characterized by that. When one has this characterization of an integration carried to the point of fulfillment, of completion, that completion is not inert, but it resonates. And what does it resonate? It resonates a field. I used to call it, education on that level is a field of inquiry. Rather than a path of learning, it's a field of inquiry. Rather than there being an instruction sequence that one must follow to know, instead there is an openness which one must practice in order to participate. And if you don't practice and participate with it, you don't know. It's like the Mullah Nasruddin story that we began. Those who know will tell those who don't. There's no need for a teacher at all. So you go where all perfected teachers go, to the elephant graveyard. Field theory, at the same time, is particle theory. The particles always have to follow an integral path, and that integral path is inversely proportionate to the field that's generated, so that particles and fields, or particles and waves, are always inversely proportionate. That means they're always in a ratio, and that ratio is real. I used to call it the ratio of the real. Here are the quotations from this, and then we'll take our break. He writes, 1994, Cambridge University Notes on Physics. It is a fact that the theory, the particle theory, or rather the successful part, is perturbation theory. Up to this day, the methods for dealing with non-perturbative situations are less than perfect. In fact, no one, for example, can claim to understand fully the structure of the proton or the pion in terms of quarks. The masses and other properties of these particles have not really been understood in any detail. It must be added that there exists, strictly speaking, no sound starting point for dealing with non-perturbative situations. Not only do we not know, we don't even know where to begin. Why? Because the beginning is not discernible by any distinguishing between is and is not. It is only discernible by the is and the is not coming present together in a paradox, and on that scale, one can begin to differentiate. The more or less standard formalism, the operator formalism, uses objects that can be proven mathematically not to exist. So that one uses Feynman diagrams, which work on the basis of path integrals to characterize what happens in reality, and they in fact work very well. But there's no way to mathematically show the foundation and underpinning because of a paradox in terms of reality. Nature is always an integral energy, but that's only half the story when it comes to the spirit. It's like the stem of a flower. For it to be real, the stem has to bud and flower. The bud is the transformation. The flower is the differential field that generates. Our stem is the spinal column, and the brain is the flower. And as long as we take them both together, then we have a double ecology that is fully complementary. If you take the brain away from the spinal column, you will have a thing in a glass jar. It won't have any electricity. And that Leyden jar, instead of having universal dynamic in it, will just simply have an object on display. Like Einstein's brain, I believe, is on display in some kind of a jar. You can't talk to it. But when that brain was in Einstein's body, integrated by his spinal column, that brain could flower like very few objects in this universe, and flower it did many, many, many times. Let's take a break and we'll come back. In early Neolithic times, the prayer was always like this. It's called the Orans position. It's one of the oldest of all, and what this is an openness to the divine. No one would be presumptive enough to do this. Whereas in historical development, as the path integral developed, the very concentration of prayer expressed itself in the integration of the hands together. And now this is the way that prayer would be conceived and presented symbolically. This is just a little example from a smidgen of iconographical history to show you that this path integral, the language that we're using this morning, is not only the way that nature works, but all processes that participate or partake in nature have this as a characteristic of their structure, of the structure that is what they are, and of the structure that is reflected in what they are not. And that both those together form a continuity of their existence. Not only their existence, but their non-existence. Now, if we grind too much finer, if we, in our education at this point, pursue it more specifically, we get more and more paradox very quickly. So one has to learn in a wisdom education not to push it at certain points. You can't be a charming 4-year-old who asks why again and again and again. One has to be 5 and just do it. Who cares why after a while? You can ask why once or twice, but don't pursue it. Why? Because the why in a repetition becomes a kind of algorithm that keeps the integration tightening in a situation that is too clumsy to float it, and you begin to have this kind of confusion, this excess of rebounding. The images that perception has in nature are very distinct. They're uncannily accurate. In fact, we use the term, you can use the term pristine. They're so crisp and exact, and they can be calibrated, they can be measured to any degree of exactness that you would like. You can take a single photon from a star and do a spectrographical readout And you can tell that this is a class M star or a class B star, main sequence, white dwarf, whatever. There's a star very much like our sun, which is on the cover of Sky and Telescope of January 1996, 51 Pegasi. And we know that it has a very large planet that orbits it now. Absolutely. Why? Because the perturbations of the light from that star show the signature of a planet which not only circles around that star, but like all stars and planets, they circle together in a complementarity around a central space called the barycenter. So if you're looking just at the star, you would think that the star is not moving. It shouldn't move. The ego says the stars don't move. The ego says, with its arrogance, speaking for God, heaven is so secure because it doesn't move. Whereas the truth is, if it didn't move, that would be a hell of a fix. That's a triple entendre again. As my friend Dr. Heller says, shit. The perturbation is only a perturbation from the standpoint of trying to look at a star as fixed. When you understand that stars and planets both orbit around a mutual center, which is not anything but a locus in space, then one can conceive of a star system in terms of the system. But as long as one looks at a star in terms of the star only, the presence of a planet can only be characterized as a perturbation of that star's movement. It shows up in the light. All physics up to this point in the development of human history on this particular planet has been based on the perturbation. There's no good foundation mathematically for non-perturbative reality, but it's coming. This next century, this next generation, the kids born now, they're not going to read about perturbation theory. They won't. It'll be a historical anomaly. It'll be a Neolithic worldview that was ego-bound and colorblind and simply won't be used anymore. The physics of the 21st century in about 15, 20 years will be on non-perturbative equilibriums. Like music, it'll deal with harmonics of consonants, of reality wholes, the wholenesses, rather than fixating on one part and then trying to deduce from the perturbations of that one part what the whole looks like. If you try to characterize the is not simply by the is, you slam the door on possibilities of creativity and development. Why do that? It's like the Mullah Nasruddin story. The world of is not is equally as interesting as the world of is. And the fact that the two form a continuity is a characteristic of the way in which an integral path functions. We know that an integral path functions all the way to perfection, but we cannot follow it all the way to perfection. We can follow it to a threshold beyond which we cannot follow it, but when it reemerges As a flower from the stem, we can see that something has transformed and it must have a continuity. There's no way that the petals of the flower are not a continuity with the stem, even though they are different. They're radically different. Now, all structures in reality show this, even on level of hydrogen and helium, how much more so on level of organics, how much more so on level of spirit. Spirit beings like ourselves are mostly flower. We're like the old ivory soap ad, probably 99 and 44/100% flower, which leaves just 56/100 for stem. So why all the egotistical fuss over trying to stay stem when you should flower? And the stem is beautiful. It's necessary. Without the stem, there's not going to be any flower. But to stay in stemness misses the whole point. The stemness is the tribal level. The stemness is the mythic language horizon. The stemness is the brain and the world that it's able to create. But that spherical world, that mythic language makes, is a mind which essentially is in the integral path and must eventually curtail creativity and curve it back in, and that curving it back in makes it reductive. So while it starts out being really gorgeous, symbols start out to be very gorgeous, if you keep pushing them, why, symbols curdle and become reductive. And finally, they become tyrannical. There was rarely a symbolic world more abstractly pure than Nazism. Please don't go that way. Or on the other hand, there's no need to do that at all. The word is obviate. We can obviate that ever happening again by an education that understands this is foolish excess. The realm of life, the realm of all of the qualities that we cherish, is available and achievable. Why would you go hide in the dark corners of reduction? Now, as we were talking about this morning, as we were saying this morning, let's go back over it so that we can develop it. We're in the science section, and we're talking particularly now about Richard P. Feynman. And we talked last week about how Feynman was a very odd character. Feynman had a surrealistic personality. Surrealism is the juxtaposition of two or more different planes that have no relationship to each other. Put a giraffe's eye on an ironing board. It's surreal. Feynman's personality was like that. He was like a New York City cab driver who happened to be a mathematical genius and was thrust into the world of Los Alamos and atomic bomb planning when he was still literally a boy. And so he literally became this kind of very surreal, odd juxtaposition, which later worked to his advantage because he saw that he could only survive as a human being by transcending the polarities which he was. There was no way to integrate the Brooklyn boy with the mathematical genius. They don't mix. Or they only mix like oil and water if you keep shaking the emulsion. And if they settle down at all, they separate out. And what are you going to do? You're going to be faced with a quandary that you're going to have a life of turbulence because if you calm down at all, you become schizophrenic. What are you going to do? You transform. And the first way that you transform, the very first transformation that happens, is that horizon, that mythic horizon, that image base, which your feelings are integrated along, you learn that you can rotate that. You don't have to do any fancy transformations to it. You don't have to do any kind of highfalutin super dharma transformations to it. A simple transformation is to rotate it. That rotation of a horizon like that transformation in math is called a Lorentz transformation. That's what it is. And there's no way to understand modern mathematics or modern physics or modern astronomy without understanding that transformation of rotation makes a huge difference in the way in which one is able to accept the knowing of something complex, especially like space-time. If one wants to characterize space-time, which is a four-dimensional continuum, we can say that x represents the dimensions. And so if we have 4 dimensions, you would think that we would write it x sub 1, x sub 2, x sub 3, and x sub 4, with commas in between the x's. But a very deep peculiarity comes to the surface immediately, because when you're dealing with fundamentals, when you're dealing with symbolic structures, right away, the initial starting point of those symbolic structures, which is always the language matrix out of which they come, presents itself, comes present, and is there either as a blessing or as a curse or as something neutral. It's 3-valued, actually. In this case, mathematicians found out late in the 19th century that there was a kind of a weird bind in numbering. Because in the Latin language mind, the Romans always started with 1. When you write Roman numerals, the first one you write is 1. Whereas the Greek language mind always starts with 0. So that if you're characterizing space-time with a kind of a Greek-based mind, x0 characterizes time. And you write it x0, comma, x1, comma, x2, comma, x3. But if you're using a Latin-based mentality, a Roman mind, you write it x sub 1, comma, x sub 2, comma, x sub 3, comma, x sub 4. And then you say, well, time is the 4th dimension. Now you get into different realms if you start with 1 or you start with 0. You get into completely different realms. What kind of realm do you get into? If you start with 1, you characterize space as 3-dimensional and time as the 4th dimension. And the tendency then is to add time to space, to say space and time. That time is somehow added to space. Space becomes some kind of fundament, some kind of cup, to which then you add time. And that makes space time. That's completely different from a mathematic that characterizes time as the 0 dimension and space as 3 dimensions that exfoliate themselves out from that zero base. How does that work out? How does that turn out? It can be abstruse or it can be fairly simple. I have to toe the line between the simple and the abstruse and make it colorful so it can be hearable. Otherwise, it's not very hearable. It either seems so abstruse that it doesn't make any sense, or it seems so simple, why would anybody point it out? Remember that we were also talking this morning about Marcel Proust, about how Proust's remembrance of things past showed that the more that you clarify, get rid of the confusion of associative rebounds, and the more that perception clarifies itself, the more that time past tends to become present. So if one became completely clear about something, it would be right here. It would be now. Complete clarity, perfect clarity is now. It doesn't have a past. And because it doesn't have a past, it also does not project into the future, which means that the flow of time is not happening. And if the flow of time is not happening, then it's very easy to understand why you would characterize the dimension of time as x sub 0. But if you are used to, if you're habituated to, if you're egotistically invested in, if you're mentally paid your dues and you got proprietorship about time being a fourth dimension, it's got to be x sub 4. You don't want to hear that. That's 0 is anathema. Well, present, it means like nothingness, right? So instead of eternity, the emotional feeling is that we better stay away from it because it's nothingness. And somebody completely caught into that was somebody like Jean-Paul Sartre, whose great book was called Being and Nothingness, not Being and Eternity. Simone de Beauvoir would have been a much happier lady had she had a man who was writing a book called Time and Being and Eternity. No. And part of the sociopathical complications of Sartre was that one of the egotistical investments of being and nothingness, all are nothingness, is that turns into a polarity that is really at war with each other. And the only way to overcome that kind of warlike, polarized philosophical stance is to superimpose upon it some kind of integrating process which dominates it, and the integrating process that dominates it, that Sartre found ready to use, was Marxism. Dialectical materialism. What? The Czechs say it better than me. What's the stuff? Dialectical, it means overcoming polarity, overcoming the oscillation by forcing a current on it. Materialism, it means stuff, right? Real stuff. Hard goods. Guns and ammunition and real stuff that make power in the world real. This is what we want. We want steel to build tanks. This is real progress. And yet, notice that the polarities in here lend themselves egotistically to all kinds of confusion. And the confusion has no end. I mean, confusion is profligate. It begets more confusion without any, they don't have to take out licenses or nothing. No blood test, just propagate. The confusion demons, right? They have litters. There should be a sign in education, right? No litter bugs for mental processes. Not only that, the ego will defend itself, and especially defend itself because it has an emotional investment not to have things clear. That's why you don't hear something initially that is clarified. You can hear something which is recognizable because it fits in with the habituation matrix that's in place. Oh, yeah, that's right. Well, the response, that's right, means you didn't learn anything at all. Because that identification process, that's button pushing. That's all that is. So, teacher who makes really good sense to you first out, you've wasted your time. You didn't learn anything, but especially you didn't learn how to learn. The headline I had on a little booklet that I did in 1970 was Prepare to be Prepared. You not only have to be open, but you have to be open to openness itself. And the master of that quality is thorough. In all the world, in all time, all history, the best human being who was ever open to openness was Henry David Thoreau. He's absolute astounding genius at openness, which is why we start the education, like we'll start on January 6th, with Thoreau and the I Ching. The I Ching, which does not deal with chance, but deals with change. And Thoreau, who deals with openness. Because if you put change as a form into a context which is openness, you get the free play of reality. And with that starting point, it's like going even deeper than the Greek language mind. It's like going back to old Paleolithic wisdom. Somebody asked Gandhi one time how old yoga was. He said, it's older than the hills. It means that the universe started being wise before hills were formed. It started being wise when hydrogen atoms began to get together with gravity and make stuff. Wisdom is that deep. Why does it work? It doesn't work because someone hopes it's going to work egotistically, but it's even deeper than the way it is. So that when you come to understanding contemporary science, and that's what this section of the education is about, contemporary science, if you want to follow a temporal synthesizing dimension of space, you get something like a temporal order. But beyond the temporal order is something which can be characterized as self-organization. And self-organization, auto waves and structures far from equilibrium, means that differential fields that are completely inverse to integration are highly conscious and intelligible, but not in terms of orders and instructions, but in terms of self-creativity. A human being who is flowered is free. As someone once said that a room full of Socrateses, it would be very difficult to get them to agree. They would have to discuss every aspect of everything until they finally got it, and then they could probably do something, and when they did it, then it would be unanimous. And when somebody told Gandhi this, he said, well, that's the way human society in the future is going to be. I see that human decisions on a social basis are going to be unanimous, or that nobody will do it. And everyone say, well, this is impractical. Yeah, if you're dealing with ego-bound people, nothing will ever get done. But if you deal with people who eventually all get hungry, they will all agree to go get food. It's relentless. That kind of truth-seeking is relentless. And somebody who seeks in that way, Gandhi called a satyagrahi. Satyagraha. Sat means, sat can either mean to sit in which case it's pronounced sad, or sat means to grasp. It means to have the position firmly, which means truthfulness, that your position is real. And graha, grasp. Satya, graha, truth grasping, reality holding. And one of the principles of a karma yogi like Gandhi was that as long as one spiritual being holds truth in a situation, the entire situation eventually, by universal law, must integrate itself around that, because that's the only real point there. It doesn't matter how confused the situation is, how recalcitrant they are, how powerful they are, how much they hate your guts, how much they non-acknowledge you. All of that is irrelevant, because if a karma yogi holds truth in continuity, the entire integral path will flow through that point. And so it's an unequal contest. One Bhagavad Gita spirit warrior against a planet of confusion, there's no contest. He's going to win every time. So the old stereotype that God's going to send whole armies of angels, he doesn't need armies. He needs one little quiet messenger girl who just simply doesn't let go of truth. And there's nothing evil can do. As a universal principle, she's going to win. It doesn't look like it. She'll be there. Why? Because path integrals in nature are the synthesizing truth of the way in which energy works. And the more concentrated that integration is, those further concentrations are more effective than the previous concentrations. Myth is much more powerful in terms of its concentration of integration than is ritual. What you do is very powerful, but what you say is more powerful. And when language interiorizes and becomes what you think, that's much more powerful. The mind is so powerful, it's more powerful than language, and language much more powerful than ritual comportment, ritual activity. But no matter how powerful that whole cycle of integration is, the very first stage of differentiation is so much more powerful that it indexes all of it. One iota of vision, of visionary consciousness, indexes an entire cycle of integral nature. I guess the most popular way of characterizing this was the one of the questions asked of Jesus about John the Baptist. Isn't he a holy man? Isn't he a perfected man? Indeed he was. Except that he was perfected in the integral realm. Limited himself to this. And the reply was, yes, John the Baptist is very powerful, but even the least of the children of the kingdom are greater than he. Why? Because once one allows for that transformation to occur, and one goes into differential mode of transcendent consciousness, one leaves behind the limitations of the integral path and enters into the generation of fields. And fields, like a magnetic field, is capable of extraordinary reach. The electrical force in a wire can be tens of thousands of volts. It can be 1,000,000 volts, but it's limited to the wire. Whereas a magnetic field goes on to infinity. There's no way that an electrical wire 1 centimeter from your finger, no matter if it has 1,000,000 volts or anything, can do much to you at all. But a magnetic field goes on. So that the differential aspect of energy has a wide-reaching, those energy fields have a wide-reaching quality. And an education that does not deliver an intelligence and a sensibility to that range of effectiveness truncates the people, leaves them bereft of vision, which means that if they pursue the techniques that they have learned, they're going to be unable to distinguish the point at which those very techniques which have been learned are helping them when they start to become reductive and start to poison them. It's like enclosing somebody in a room that you seal off. And they're very happy. You have everything that you ever wanted, except that the room is sealed. And eventually the very air that you breathe will become poisonous and will kill you. What's the problem with the ego? That it, by nature, is limited to its own definition. It's sealed off. That's why. And especially it's sealed off because it can only occupy a time limit duration. And there's nothing more pathetic than to see an eternal spirit being gagging on egotistical time limitations. The ancient Iranian symbol for that was somebody who's very powerful, has a lion face, and has the serpent of the world wrapped around their body, and that serpent's going to strangle the life out of them, even though they have this lion-like power. So you shine for a few years, and the rest of eternity is dead. What kind of advantage is that? Now you can see that this becomes very quickly religious-like talk, but this isn't religious instructions, education. This is about science. It's about the way in which, if our characterizing of reality to ourselves is not opened completely, we will not even know that we're strangling ourselves. We will not even have a clue. Because the very equipment, the very techniques that we use to determine for ourselves that we're advancing will identify that we continue to advance because we're still using what worked, only now it's working in the opposite way. And so it's pernicious. Ignorance is pernicious. In the classical Sanskrit, that circle of ignorance is called pratitya samutpaya, the cycle of dependent origination. Nothing is original. Everything is dependent on everything else and on it ad infinitum. Pratitya samutpaya. It means that that circle goes on, but anything within that circle that is alive is eventually going to succumb to the coils of the very motion of that circle. Going to suffocate. So that if one is seeking anything intelligently at all, one is seeking to be free of that circle. And one of the advantages is that any point of that circle, once broken, the entire ensemble, the entire structure, not only folds, not only crumples, it evaporates with such completeness that it leaves no trace whatsoever. So that the saying, again and again, 8,765,423 yogis say, it must have been an illusion because it doesn't even leave a trace. Why doesn't it leave a trace? Because there's no integral path medium in a differential conscious field that would allow for the recording of a trace. It's not only that there are no traces of this illusion, there are no traces of anything. One doesn't need traceable paper anymore to navigate. And so without an education delivering this practicality to its students, you're wasting your time. Much less your money, much less everything else, the beautiful qualities of yourself. How does it work out? In terms of our science today, we're talking about Richard Feynman, we're talking about path integrals, we're talking about the way in which space-time is characterized as 4 dimensions. If you use a Roman mind, space is 3-dimensional and time is the 4th dimension that's added to it. How is it added to it? Time is added in the Roman mind by its motion. It's the motion of time. So one then thinks in the Roman mind, and believe me, there's a Chinese Roman mind that's just as Roman. Martian Romans are just as bad as Earth Romans. It's universal. If space is conceived of a box, a 3-dimensional box, through which a current of time moves, and that's how things work, that's space-time. One doesn't understand that the field of consciousness that's also generated by that kind of quality is a complementation and inversely proportional to it. Well, how does that inverse proportion work? The more that you put the energy into the electrical, the less the magnetic quality is going to have play. And so you have an electromagnetic energy, a very large electrical complement, a very small magnetic complement. But just as real as that electromagnetic energy, which is characterized by the Maxwell equations, those equations solve in a negative mode vis-a-vis the electromagnetic formulation, which means that there's another kind of energy field, a magnetoelectric field. And when you solve those equations, you find out the magnetoelectric field. Its oscillation, is that a good word? Its oscillatory ballet is about 10 billion times the frequency of the electromagnetic. And just as real. So that a form which is real in the magnetoelectric spectrum would have 10 billion times the energy. No wonder that visions of angels look like a bright being whose voice is like many waters and whose eyes are like fire and whose hair is like white wool. The figure Daniel saw in his vision when his 3 friends were thrown into the furnace to reduce them, right? The furnace of the tyrannical mind of the Neo-Babylonians to reduce them down, and the 3 companions of Daniel are thrown in there to be reduced, and they're still okay in there, but there was a 4th being in there with them. And when Nebuchadnezzar looked in, he saw this figure with skin like burnished brass and white wool hair and eyes of fire and a voice like many waters. And the book of Daniel was written about 160 BC by the teacher of righteousness. And the only other time that that figure is seen in a vision again is about 90 AD when old St. John was redoing an apocalypse left by John the Baptist and redid it as the book of Revelation. Added a chapter in the front and a chapter in the back and sandwiched it in, and there was the figure again. And the figure was there because John the Baptist saw the same figure. John the Baptist about 35 AD saw the same figure that was seen about 160 BC. He saw it in the same free mind. And the book of Revelation, the book of Daniel are the only two places that you find that image. But it's not an image, it's deeper than an image. It's like symbolic, but it's deeper than symbolic. It's original, visionary, differential reality. And one can tell when one looks with an analytic based on field consciousness, openness, one can see that that quality is a parenthesis surrounding a mystery matrix, that they belong together. And that mystery matrix is the teacher of righteousness who starts the Essene community, and John the Baptist who brings it to its culmination and perfection. And within that ovoid of about 200 years are the Essenes, the perfected ones, who have one purpose only, and that is to get rid of all the confusions that have come in through sociological jumbling and just let the perception of the real be exactly what it is, and only what it is. Nothing other than what it is. And so the whole discipline at that time was to calm down to the equilibrium where the horizon of the mythic language mind that curves around by all itself and makes a sphere, and that's like an insert within the brain of man, shrouding the planet in a mist, is able to be dispersed by the rising of a new vision. And it's only to prepare a space where the new vision can take its first step and come in. And when it does, something different, something new, something conscious. We're out of time. We're going to come back to this very spot next week. What I would suggest for this next week to help you to work with this, a little bit of an assignment, a little bit of a project for yourself, something that you can work in. Try to feel outside of a space dimension. Can you feel? Can you have feeling outside of space? Play with that a little bit. Analyze that a little bit. Read up on it if you want to. One of the keys for you is to use a musical form. It can be any musical form whatsoever. It can be a classical musical form. It can be a modern rock song that has a form, whatever it is. Can a musical form deliver a feeling toned quality to you without time? So the question then is feeling a function of space or is it a function of time? If you can bring your investigations with that, your struggle with that, next Saturday, whatever the result, just bring your struggles with that. That'll be plenty, and you'll be able to be here with what I'm going to try and deliver. And I will work all week on it to try and deliver it as best I can. Nobody knows how to say these things yet. This kind of saying was always secret teaching that nobody ever said. Nobody told me. And nobody told anybody I learned from. But the time is here where somebody has to begin to try. And so we'll make an attempt next week, and we'll see how good we can do. How good can we do? Nobody's going to grade us. There isn't anybody to grade us, to judge us or empire. The only criterion is that we give it a try. That's all. Because even if it's gibberish, our gibberish eventually, in 100 or 1,000 years, will be a language for others. So let's just chatter away like babies. Something new. Who knows, but it may be the only exercise that prepares the tongue, and the pellets to be able to use language. So gibberish has its purpose.